Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of the PhenoLab. Today, it's a real pleasure and honor to have with us Professor Thomas Fuchs. Professor Fuchs, psychiatrist and a philosopher, is a Karl Jaspers Professor of Philosophy and Psychiatry at Heidelberg University in Germany. His main areas of research include a phenomenological philosophy and a psychopathology, embodied and enactive cognitive science, and interactive concept of social cognition. His clinical work focuses on psychopathology and psychotherapy of affective and schizophrenic disorders. Professor Fuchs has authored over 400 journal articles, work chapters, and several books. He is the editor-in-chief of Psychopathology and president of the German Society of Phenomenological Anthropology and Psychopathology. In 2023, Professor Fuchs was awarded the Erich Fromm Prize for Humanistic Psychology. Among his recent publications, I'm happy to recall Ecology of the Brain, the Phenomenology and Biology of the Embodied Mind, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and Defense of the Human Being, Foundational Questions of an Embodied Anthropology, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and more recently, the last book published last year entitled Verkörperte Gefühle zur Phänomenologie von Affektivität und Interaffektivität, published by Surkamp, Berlin. Thomas, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesca. It's a pleasure to be with you again in this PhenoLab series, and I start right away, if that's okay with you. The topic is a bit different from the usual ones because it's about our primary connectedness to living beings, or what I call conviviality. Let's start with a motto of Victor Hugo. In the relations of man with the animals, with the flowers, with all the objects of creation, there's a whole great ethic, scarcely perceived as yet, which will at length break through into the light and which will be the corollary and the complement to human ethics. Well, that might be a kind of prediction which may come true in these decades, as I try to show in what follows. First, I would like to show some images which should convey an experience before we go on to analyze it. What we can see, imagine, and above all, empathize with are living beings in their environment. So we see life in a world in which it has made its home and sustains itself, a world that provides it with space, light, air, and food. We also see life in a world in which it struggles to survive. We see how it braces itself against the wind, warms itself against the cold, nourishes itself in the wasteland, or clings to a crack in the wall. So we can see life and feel life in its delicacy, in its exposure, in its precariousness and threat. We feel all this because we are ourselves alive, because as living beings we feel an elementary compassion for this endangerment, and we ultimately always perceive the possibility of death latently in the background of these images. And we feel this because we live in a certain sense like these creatures, and because we live with them on Earth in a commonality and a community of the living, which I call conviviality. Now, the term is derived from the Latin convivere, to live together, and its usual meaning, as you all know it, is, of course, sociality and also something like cheerful togetherness, which has to do with the Latin convivium, so the banquet. However, I use the term in the primary etymological sense, living with, in order to describe the primary and original kinship that we feel with living beings and other people, due to our shared bodily structures, life processes, and life interests. And in that sense, conviviality has several aspects which I would like to examine in what follows. Now, the first aspect is an epistemological one and was formulated above all by Hans Jonas. Life can only be recognized by life. This is fundamental for our relationship to living nature. The question of what life is cannot be separated from the experience of what it is like to be a living being. And we ourselves have this experience as living, bodily, embodied beings. The biological, that means the scientific study and research of the living, can neither fully explain nor replace this primary experience. So, conviviality means that only as fellow creatures do we recognize other living beings and can distinguish them from inanimate things. Now, the second aspect is one of natural philosophy and also of ecology. Conviviality can give us insight into what characterizes life and its processes, and how living things are connected to their environment. So we share with other living beings elementary conditions such as birth, growth, nourishment, respiration, drives and striving, aging, and death. And we share with them the relationship to the environment that is determined by metabolism, exchange, embeddedness, and niche formation. That means by a kind of reciprocity and coupling that doesn't allow us to think of living things without relationality. And finally, we are connected to other living beings, to plants and animals, through mutual dependencies, give and take, living from food, living from other life. So conviviality describes this ecological embedding and interconnectedness of all living beings to form a kind of comprehensive community. And now the third aspect is an ethical one. The insight that we recognize other living beings primarily because of our kinship with them, and that we are connected with them through reciprocal relationships within an ecological whole. Now, these insights can become the basis for a commitment through which we also realize the kinship and interconnectedness with all life as our responsibility. And if the basis of our relationship to living nature is a participatory, compassionate recognition, one might say, then this also gives rise to an attitude of care and commitment to this nature, an attitude in which our own experience of corporeality and aliveness becomes the basis of an ecological ethic. Now, so far, the discourse, the ecologically motivated discourse on nature, does not address the nature of humans insofar as we, qua body, are nature ourselves. However, when conviviality is understood as intercorporeality, then our embodiment can establish an ecological ethic that overcomes the separation of human culture and physical nature. Because as embodied beings, we ourselves are part of nature that can then no longer be understood as just extended matter and exploited at will. And thus the key contribution of the concept of conviviality, I think, lies in the possible integration of the three aspects which it encompasses. The participatory concept of recognizing the living is directly related to ontological interdependence and interconnectedness. And this in turn forms the basis for the ethical responsiveness which we experience when we become aware of this interconnectedness. And all three aspects are grounded in our bodily experience of living with, also suffering with. That means our conviviality with the living. And now I will take a closer look at these three aspects of conviviality, starting with perceiving life, so the epistemological aspect. According to the prevailing view of neo-Darwinian biology, as we find, for example, in Richard Dawkins or Dennis Bray and others, organisms are ultimately machines driven by algorithms and programs, and life is nothing other than information processing. However, our own experience of life is quite different, namely that of a spontaneous, self-acting vitality, a bodily dynamic that moves us, an elemental drive and striving, and it is the experience of our bodily nature as something that precedes our conscious cognition and action, something that emerges of its own accord, stirring and becoming sensible, from which we first become aware of ourselves and to which we owe our existence. Hans Jonas combined this experience with an epistemological argument that is directed against the reductionism of the biosciences. As he says, no biologist could locate and research the phenomenon of life if he didn't always already know from his own self-experience what life is, namely selfhood, self-expression, self-movement, being after something, in drive, striving, purposefulness. In one word, life as subjectivity. The German physician Victor von Weizsäcker also referred to this inescapable starting point for any science of the living. I quote from his Gestaltkreis: "In order to research the living, you have to participate in life. One can attempt to derive the living from the non-living, but this endeavor has so far failed. One can also strive to deny one's own life in science, but this is a self-deception. We find life as living things. Science began with the awakening of questions in the midst of life." And Jonas formulates this in his well-known sentence, which I already mentioned: life can only be recognized by life. So suppose we were to look at an organism from the perspective of a disembodied and purely analytical, mathematical mind, say from the point of view of a mathematician God. Would we then be able to recognize the interiority and purposefulness of the organism? From a disembodied and analytical standpoint, the organism would be dissolved in a collection of objective physical chemical events, and all characteristics of an interiority, a self-related autonomous unity, would ultimately appear as purely fictitious. However, as bodily beings, we are able to say what no disembodied onlooker would have a cause for saying, namely that the mathematical God misses the decisive point, the point of life itself, namely its being self-centered individuality, being for itself and in contraposition to all the rest of the world, with an essential boundary dividing inside and outside. For Jonas, life is never pure externality, but indispensable subjectivity. And only because we ourselves are living beings, through the witnessing of our own body, do we have access to the living and are able to perceive it as such. So what does this witnessing of our body, our experience of living embodiment, consist of? At its core, it is about the elementary feeling of being alive. And this, as I submit, is made up of two components, which I would like to call vitality on the one hand and conation on the other hand. Vitality refers to a continuous bodily background experience that can be described as a pre-reflective self-awareness, or also as a core affective state with the hedonic poles of well-being and displeasure, pleasure and displeasure. It initially corresponds to a vague feeling of existence, but when it spreads to the current life situation as a whole, it also merges into the phenomena of mood, attunement, or existential feelings. Now, second, conation, from the Latin conatus, impulse, urge, striving. This refers to an elementary energetic momentum that manifests itself in drive, impulse, urge, and desire, and which represents the fundamental driving force for the directed movement of the living being. And here too we find a polarity, namely the energetic poles of activation and deactivation, vigor and fatigue. The continuous basis of experience, that means the fundamental self-affection of life, thus consists in the fundamental polarities of pleasure and displeasure of on the one hand, and activation deactivation on the other hand. And we feel both in our lived body. This is exactly what we also perceive in other living beings: their sentience, pleasure, displeasure, pain, and their striving, pursuit of a goal, just as a cat chases a mouse, or an amoeba moves forward with its pseudopodia, groping, searching in order to find food and incorporate it. There's always the purposefulness of the organism as such and its urge to live. Albert Schweitzer expressed this in his famous sentence, "I am life that wants to live in the midst of life that wants to live." Conviviality in this epistemic sense therefore means that we recognize the living in a sympathetic way, as feeling and striving like ourselves. Now, this is certainly in contrast to the modern concept of knowledge that guides the natural sciences. Here, the subject of knowledge has nothing to do with its object. For Bacon or for Descartes, knowledge of nature means keeping away from it, not being affected by it, not mixing with it. However, there's another, a more participatory way of knowing, namely through co-enactment, through bodily resonance, sympathy. So, for example, when we hear a song, we sing along inwardly somehow. And we feel the figures that we see as subtle movement impressions in our own body. And the movements of an animal towards an object are also co-perceived in our body. As we know today, the system of mirror neurons in the brain also provides a neuronal component for this. Cognition through sympathy and through bodily resonance means a participation in what is recognized. And this participation presupposes a kinship between the recognizer and the recognized. So what animals are, what plants are, is in principle not alien to us because we know it from the inside. For Hans Jonas, the anthropomorphism of this knowledge is not a disadvantage, but precisely the prerequisite for recognizing and perceiving living things in their selfhood. Of course, this participatory knowledge says nothing about how far we can extend the assumption of sentience and drive experience to increasingly simple living beings. So when a bacterium moves towards food and away from harmful substances in chemotaxis, It shows a rudimentary form of discrimination and of directed relationship to its environment. We might also say it gives these substances meaning for its survival, the one attractive, the one aversive, and thus showing what an activism calls sense-making, a crucial characteristic of living systems. But can the bacterium also experience this sense-making as pleasant and as unpleasant, with different hedonic values and valences? Well, opinions on this differ, and the evidence for and against is inconclusive, as even Thompson has summarized in a recent paper. And I will not explore this difficult question in every detail here, but I would like to make a suggestion which mediates maybe between the positions. Even if we cannot be sure whether amoeba or bacteria feel something or not, we can always understand life from our self-awareness minus consciousness, so to speak. So that means in a privative way. This doesn't result in a purely external view of the living, as if it were a merely physical system, but sentience already precedes consciousness. We can, for example, feel a slight headache or a hunger before we become consciously aware of them. And when we do become fully aware, we realize that we were already hungry before, without being able to say what that hunger actually was like. Similarly to how we sometimes only notice a latent, repetitive sound once it stops and silence suddenly sets in. And we realize we have heard it, but not on the conscious level. An experience only becomes fully conscious when it reaches a certain degree of intensity or contrast. Nevertheless, it was already our experience beforehand. So there can be a feeling and striving that is not yet conscious, but is nevertheless not simply physiological or subpersonal. The decisive factor which connects us with all lower animals is the enactment of life that has and shows those tendencies, whether they become conscious in varying degrees or not. And in the case of plants, too, we speak of young shoots, in German Triebe, that means more or less urges, the shoots that emerge from the earth to the light, and just as we feel the urges of life within ourselves. And this indicates that the will to live, as Schweitzer calls it, an urge to exist and develop, connects us with all plant and animal life, whether the urge is conscious or unconscious. Jonas speaks of the supreme concern of organism with its own being and continuation in being, and such an interest is not an independent psychological state, but a form of existence of the living as a whole. It belongs to the existential structure of the organism's self-production. The question how far the experience of life actually extends cannot be answered conclusively, but it is also not decisive for the epistemic concept of conviviality. In any case, it is about a participatory recognition of what constitutes life. Only as fellow creatures do we recognize other living beings in their selfhood and self-becoming, and can distinguish them from inanimate things. Now we move to the second, to the natural, philosophical, and ecological aspect. Conviviality can give us insight into what characterizes life and its processes, how living things are connected to each other and to their environment. So what constitutes life in our self-experience? First of all, it is elementary conditions that we share with other living beings. As I already said, birth, growth, nutrition, respiration, reproduction, drive and striving, aging and death. All these processes initially represent changes and transitions in which the changing entity nevertheless remains itself and preserves itself as such. Further, these processes each have a particular temporal form, namely that of the rhythm and the cycle. In bodily terms, living processes are never linear, but they recur periodically, whether within individuals or in their generational succession. We can illustrate this cyclicality using the basic example of breathing, a rhythmic process of rising and falling that continuously sustains our lives without us having to consciously do it. It is precisely in the pause at the low point of exhalation that we can experience the following inhalation as emerging by itself, as a self-activity of the body. However, breathing also means a constant exchange with the nature that surrounds us, namely the atmosphere. The air envelops and permeates us, usually even without being aware of it. So we are air creatures, just as fish are water creatures. The metabolism in respiration and nutrition shows us that life is not located in an environment like in a container, but that its interior and exterior constantly merge into one another, that they are intertwined. Conviviality not only means the perception of other living beings and their exchange of substances with the environment. Our kinship with them also implies a complementary breathing, namely of the animal and the plant world. We breathe in what plants breathe out, and vice versa. The air is therefore no independent, inorganic environment, but is itself part of the life process and shaped by it. In ancient times, the paradigm of this intertwining of life and environment, the mutual interpenetration and of inside and outside and the exchange of substances, was called the pneuma, the breath of the world, which connects all living things. The complementary respiration and metabolism of plants and animals creates the Earth's atmosphere. And this illustrates the principle according to which living beings themselves bring forth their environment, their milieu in which they live, and do not merely adapt to a pre-existing surrounding. The concept of adaptation overlooks the circular interaction of life and environment over time. Life creates its own species-specific niche, its own environment, as well as the global ecosphere in which it can thrive. Life changes the surrounding space and passes it on to future generations as its complementary environment. The interdependence of living things goes even further. The life and survival of living things presupposes the life of other living beings, be it plants or animals. So life is always also living from the life of others. Plants transform inorganic matter, light, air, and energy into organic matter from which animals live. Carnivores, in turn, live from other animals. So through mutual dependencies, through give and take, living from food, we are inextricably linked to other life. Even the intestinal flora is a symbiosis of our organism with 100 trillion other organisms inside it, so that we ourselves live together with countless living beings inside our organism. Of course, this coexistence can also become precarious and deadly, as we see from the zoonoses, so the transmission of diseases such as the COVID-19 pandemic. But that doesn't change the fact that living beings are fundamentally interdependent, and conviviality refers to this interconnectedness of all living beings. And finally, let me add that life is only possible in a liquid environment, because only water enables the dissolution of substances that is necessary for their diffusion, for their reactions, and their transformation. It is the only universal medium of transition and transformation, the protean element, one could say. The amoeba or the jellyfish are only condensations of water, coagulated currents, as it were. Corals or fish are porous, permeated by water. It enters and leaves them. And although land creatures have taken the water completely inside themselves, they still consist of about 2/3 of water, and they know thirst as a reminder of the water world from which they came. Water and air, in and around living beings, are the paradigm for a world that consists not of separate objects, but of porosities, transformations, and flows. A world not primarily of sensory-motor interaction, as inactivism focuses upon, but rather a world of immersion in the environment. In metabolism and energy transformation, living beings and the environment permeate each other. Plants and animals open themselves up to the world, allow it to penetrate them, and then excrete it again as their interior. Indeed, the so-called inorganic world also participates constantly in this immersion, namely in the form of sunlight, air, water, and minerals. It is not an inert environment, but consists of light and warmth, in which we are immersed, of earth and soil, in which we are rooted, like trees that live both in the sky and in the earth. We are embedded in the elements, in light, air, and water, so that it is not possible to make a clear distinction between the living and the non-living. Rather, we should recognize that the processes that we usually identify with life also encompass the relationships between life and non-life. So conviviality extends so far that living things also create their participatory environment, that they are permeated by it and live with it. The inorganic itself is part of life. On the other hand, this inclusion of the organic must not lead to an overstretched vitalism, such as the one advocated by James Lovelock or Lynn Margulis in their Gaia doctrine. According to this, the Earth itself forms a living system that tries to maintain its homeostasis, that is vulnerable like an organism, can fall ill, and that even pursues quasi-intentions, such as freeing itself from the disease of man or taking revenge on him. However, the mutual interpenetration of the organic and the inorganic does not mean its unification into a superordinate living system. Undoubtedly, the geosphere exhibits complex dynamics, but it is no autopoietically closed structure that is geared towards self-preservation. This distinction is important in order to differentiate conviviality from a problematic metaphorical vitalism. Now, in the third part, I will propose the principle of conviviality as the basis for an embodied ecological ethic. And this results from bringing together the first and the second aspects. From an epistemic point of view, as we have seen, conviviality can be characterized as a sympathetic perception of the living. Life can only be recognized through life. And in terms of natural philosophy, conviviality refers to the fundamental interdependence of all living things, as well as the mutual interpenetration of life and the environment. Now, the step towards ecological ethics based on conviviality is then not far away, because participatory cognition does not only mean that we share the quality of sentience and thus the experience of pleasure, displeasure, suffering, and pain, but rather that we are involved in the sentience of other living beings, that we experience and suffer with them. If our epistemic attitude towards other people and living things is primarily a sympathetic one, then our engagement also changes. Recognizing something then means being in touch with it by caring about it. And this can be seen in empathy with other humans. Stanley Cavell has argued that our primary relationship with others is not epistemic in the sense of that the theory of mind theory assumes. In everyday interaction with others, we do not draw conclusions about their inner life from an external point of view, from external signs of their behavior. Rather, understanding others means adopting an attitude of engagement and care in which their expressive behavior is not perceived as a basis for knowledge of other minds, but as a call, an appeal for an adequate response. I understand that another person feels pain precisely to the extent that I feel a concern and an obligation to respond to their expression. To a certain extent, this is a modern version of David Hume's and Adam Smith's moral sense theory, which assigned sympathy and other feelings a crucial role in the formation of moral judgment. If we take this step from affective participation to ethics, then conviviality, that means our shared ability to feel and the constitutive interdependence of the living, also becomes the basis for our effective commitment and responsibility for the living. Albert Schweitzer made this interconnectedness the basis of his ethics in his well-known formula of reverence for life. The man who has become a thinking being feels a compulsion to give to every will to live the same reverence for life that he gives to his own. That was a quotation from Albert Schweitzer. And this is where the participatory epistemology that I've highlighted in the first section finds its ethical consequence. The capacity for bodily empathy becomes compassion. And this compassion in turn becomes a concern for the beings with whom we feel a convivial connection. A participatory form of cognition is based not on a neutrality and objectivity as the primary criteria of knowledge, but on an attitude of participation. Sorry. And such forms of knowledge are currently also derived from the inactive concept of participatory sense-making. If mutual understanding and sense-making take place via interactive, subordinate processes that also include a kind of mutual incorporation, then the perception and cognition of others is inconceivable without some kind of bodily affective participation. And this can be extended to other living beings in general. Through bodily participation in the sentience of living beings, we can realize, for example, that the loss of biodiversity concerns us, even existentially. We can develop an awareness of the precariousness and vulnerability of life. And this awareness can motivate us to treat the environment responsibly. We can become aware of the loss of diversity, but also of the suffering of animals, for example, in factory farming. But not only that. if we consider the interconnectedness and interdependence of life, then the issue also concerns our own lives. Conviviality also means that we need the presence of nature, not only to survive biologically, but also to live a healthy and fulfilling life. In fact, it is the forgetting of our dependence on healthy soil, breathing forests, clean water, and clean air that has brought us to the planetary crisis of the present. In any case, an ecological ethics will attach particular importance to the interdependence of living and non-living nature. It will start from an ontology of nature that takes into account not only individual species and their competing interests, but also the physical environment and the conditions that underlie and enable the emergence of species. It will view this environment not just as a collection of dead or inert objects that are only relevant in relation to particular organisms, but as a complementary, in a sense, co-living part of the ecosphere. Technoscience treats nature only as an object present at hand, to use Heidegger's term, as a mere object to be used and exploited, without recognizing its own extrinsic being. Conviviality, by contrast, would involve making the fundamental kinship of our lived bodies with living nature the basis for a participatory view of nature as a whole. As I pointed out in the first part, this changed ontology of nature also includes a special temporality. The living world is characterized by rhythmic and cyclical processes, both within the organism and in its synchronization with cosmic rhythms, such as the course of the day, the month, and the year. Periodically, recurring deficiencies must be compensated for, and depleted resources must be regenerated. However, this cyclical time of life is fundamentally at odds with the modern project of linear progress and incessant growth. We too are living beings that depend on cycles of breathing and nourishment, exertion and recovery, and exchange with the environment. We live from water, heat, food, and energy. That means from the earth's resources. But these resources can only be regenerated cyclically. And the linear acceleration of our technologically growth-oriented culture must inevitably exhaust them. The preservation of the ecosphere, therefore, requires a balance between the linear and the cyclical principles of time, which is usually referred to today as sustainability. Acting sustainably means the increasing introduction of circular economies that keep an eye on the natural regenerative capacity of the living systems involved. It requires incorporating the unavoidable conflicting goals of consumption and regeneration of resources. So balancing linear and cyclical time and taking both into the principles of one's action. At the same time, it means satisfying the needs of the present in such a way that the possibilities of future generations are not decisively restricted. And this brings finally another cyclicality of living processes into view, namely that of reproduction, birth, and death. Responsibility for future generations includes the awareness of one's own mortality, indeed, the realization of its very necessity. The interdependence and cyclical nature of life requires that all individuals die at some point. So each of us is the result of an ever-recurring new beginning, of a chain of the living that stretches back to the very beginning of life. And this genealogical connection of all living things is cyclical. If this cycle were to be disrupted, as propagated, for example, by transhumanism in its visions of immortality, then life itself would come to a standstill. And there would be nothing more irresponsible towards future generations who would be deprived of their opportunities by the immortality of those currently living. Because due to the threat of overpopulation, they might even never see the light of the day. Conviviality, therefore, includes in particular an acceptance of our own mortality and the vulnerability of our own existence. This is the very condition for compassion for other beings who want to live like us, who are afraid of suffering and death, and for whom we can take care. To conclude, I've developed the concept of conviviality by way of three interlinked aspects. The first, as the fundamental kinship that we feel with all life and which allows us to perceive living beings as such in the first place. Second, as the interconnectedness and interdependence of all living beings, but also of the organic and inorganic world. And third, as the effective involvement resulting from the empathy with the living, which forms the basis of our responsibility for life. All three aspects are based on our embodiment, the experience of our kinship with the living, the connection of our life processes with the world around us, as well as the interbodily resonance and empathy that we feel not only with other humans, but also with other living beings. So in the end, it is our own embodiment that points to the deeply relational character of our existence, our life in relationships and in ecological contexts. However, this embedding of our lives in the community of living things is not complete. There's a special position of humans as eccentric beings, as Helmut Plessen has called it, beings who can take a stance on themselves. And this special position then consists in the fact that we are both part of nature and in opposition to it. But this is precisely the condition for environmental ethics. We can take responsibility, and the justified criticism of anthropocentrism, which characterizes today's environmental debate, often overshoots the mark and then turns into post-humanism or even anti-humanism. Post-humanists deny a special position of humans among other species and accuse classical humanism of having favored or even contributed to the abuse of human supremacy on Earth. But the reverence for life that Albert Schweitzer spoke of is an ethical attitude that only humans can adopt towards life. Only humans can become aware of their conviviality with life and thus feel reverence for it. And only eccentrically positioned beings can also care for other living beings in an empathic sense. So the often disputed special position of human beings in relation to all other plants and animals, including other primates, is realized precisely through this attitude of concern and responsibility. And thus, on the one hand, the anthropocentric humanism of the past, viewing man as the pinnacle of creation and associated with the unlimited exploitation of the earth, is certainly no longer tenable today. On the other hand, it would be wrong to throw the baby out with the bathwater and to consider humanism as obsolete, as post-humanists do. Because the responsibility for the development of the earth can only be assumed by that being which alone in the world is capable of freedom and self-determination, and that is the human being. A humanism of embodiment and conviviality would give this responsibility a new foundation that is better equipped against anthropocentrism. So in this sense, an ecological redefinition of our relationship to the environment on Earth can succeed if our embodiment and aliveness are at its center. And that means our connectedness with the natural world. Thank you very much for your attention.